Information security is not just technical. There's a human aspect involved, and fixing that is more than just identification and awareness. Our guest today is Ira Winkler. Ira is the president of Secure Mentem and the author of the book You Can Stop Stupid. He is referred to as the modern-day James Bond, given his skills in physically and technically infiltrating organizations. He is an expert in how to make people easy prey and how to prevent people from being easy prey. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey Podcast. Ira, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey Podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Can you give me a little background of who you are and what you do?
Okay, so let's see. I'll skip the jerk introduction if you've ever seen that movie and know what I'm talking about. But so anyway, I graduated college with a psychology major, and the only people that hire somebody with a psychology major was the U.S. government. So I ended up taking a few tests, and my first job was at the National Security Agency, where I started out as an intelligence analyst, and then I got into the computer field, became a computer systems analyst as well. Then I ended up doing a bunch of work with the U.S. military, U.S. intelligence agencies, traveling around the world in little green trucks for a while. And then I ended up leaving the government, went to government contracting. I always ended up on the human aspects of information security, whether it was like interface design, or I should say information systems as a whole, whether it was interface design or, making things more understandable. Then I ended up, one day somebody came to me and said, instead of going down to the Pentagon, can you make a few phone calls? And I'm like, sure, what do you want me to do? And they're like, well, call this company up, find out who they use as an overnight carrier. I'm like, okay. Then call them back and find out what computer systems they have in the library. I'm like, well, that's kind of stupid. What? They're like, well, we have a contract to find out about as much about the company as possible without breaking into their computer systems. And I'm like, okay, in that case, who cares who they use as an overnight carrier? Let's get their account numbers. And who cares what systems they have in the library? Let's get user IDs and passwords. And they're like, oh, that's a good idea. Anyway, 3 days later, I had control over one of the world's largest investment banks.
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah. So anyway, I wrote a paper about it that I presented at a professional conference because my company had a policy that if you had a paper accepted, they'd have to send you to present it. So I'm like, okay, I wrote a paper, and it turned out to be, much to my surprise, one of the most esteemed security conferences at the time, and it was called the Seminal Work in Social Engineering. And I had to look up what seminal meant and what social engineering meant. So anyway, I was a world-renowned penetration tester after that, and people started coming to me to do weirder and weirder stuff, where I would go undercover and get a job inside the company and rob them blind. I would, figured out how to hack into computers, which frankly, I didn't even know I knew how to do it. I was just doing it to use computers. And all of a sudden it was called hacking. And then I ended up eventually starting my own company. I sold the company to HP and was chief security strategist for HP Consulting for a while. Then I went off on my own and started another company called Secure Mentem, which focused on the human aspects of security, and pretty much been doing that since. So... Oh, and I wrote lots of books. You Can Stop Stupid, latest book, awesome. Everybody go out, stop what you're doing, put this on hold, buy it now. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. I love your background, such a wide kind of narrative of how you've gotten from one place to another. I have one question about the NSA, though. While you were there, were you there at the time there was no such agency?
I think I was at the time, and I'm dating myself, but at the time, the book, I didn't even know what NSA was when I was applying. I got the book, The Puzzle Palace, and it was relatively new at the time, and I got that, and I'm like, oh yeah. They're like, what do you know about NSA? They're like, while I was being interviewed, I'm like, well, I read The Puzzle Palace. They're like, oh really? I'm like, I guess that's the wrong answer.
So let's talk about the human aspects of information security. I've loved talking to people, talk to some doctors and people in the psychology realm about like why we fall for scams and the psychology of it. It's always really fascinating to me, and just all the tricks that scammers go through to separate us from our credentials or from our money.
Yeah. Well, here's an interesting aspect, and let me kind of turn, this is cliche, but let me turn the subject on the side a bit. Yes, it involves my social engineering aspects. It involves when companies pay me to try to scam them out of information. At the same time, though, it doesn't involve how to fix things. And that's an important fact I want to make sure people understand, because the way you break something is not the way you fix it. So if I tell you to break a light bulb, you can break a light bulb with a hammer, by stepping on it or whatever. Now I say, okay, fix it. You're not going to take your hammer and fix the light bulb. Frankly, it's probably irreparable. You have to go ahead and make a new one. And you have to look at people in the same way. Psychology is different in getting somebody to be secure or getting somebody to be secure as opposed to stopping them from exploiting them. And let me give a quick example, because I was talking to people in law enforcement and asking them why people fall for the old Nigerian prince scam, like this prince wants to transfer money to you. And they were like, most of these people who respond are lonely. And these pseudo-Nigerian princes are essentially the only people who interact with them on a regular basis. And in one case, they were having a recording of this Nigerian prince saying, if you don't give me more money, I'm just going to stop talking to you. And the person gave money not because they actually believed they were a prince, but because they were their only real human connection. And it takes a lot to fix problems like this. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. So yes, a little bit psychology helps me exploit people. I have to use other disciplines to try to protect people from the exploitation.
Yeah, that reminds me of a woman that I had come in contact with, and she was trying to find out about someone who had befriended her on Facebook and had scammed some money out of her and then had disappeared. And what was interesting to me is she was a little upset about the fact that she'd been scammed, but she was more upset about the fact that she wasn't able to get a hold of this person anymore, and she was worried for their safety.
Yeah, exactly.
And it really goes to that point, is that, for her, it was about the relationship, not necessarily about the money. And she was more concerned about, I just want to make sure this person's alive. And it kind of baffled me. I'm like, I don't know what I can do to help you.
Yeah, and a lot of times, and this is one of the problems that people in the security industry have, every time you hear about something happening, it's like, okay, we'll tell people what the problem is and then tell them not to do it or not to fall for it. That doesn't work. I mean, we just had, for example, at time of this recording, whenever people listen, it's about a month after the infamous Twitter hack happened, where these 17-year-old quote-unquote mastermind engineered manipulating Twitter employees to give up their credentials. And then I get on LinkedIn and see his fellow security professionals say, yeah, now we should figure out how to get that person a job at Twitter to figure out how to fix it. And I'm like, you're so damn clueless. It's unbelievable. The fact is, an organization like Twitter, it's embarrassing a 17-year-old can do this, because you have Russians, you have Chinese. Again, I could have, with what the kid did, let's give the kid credit. He went through a lot of effort to figure out how things worked. But anybody could have figured out how that worked and did the same thing if they had the effort, time, motivation, and most importantly, the questionable ethics to let them do that. Because anybody could do this. It's just having the lack of ethics and morals to actually do it. Mm-hmm. That's not a skill you want to embrace.
Yeah, that's always questionable of rewarding criminals for committing crimes.
Yeah. But it's more a misperception. I mean, you don't go ahead and find a rapist and say, okay, now that rapist was a really successful rapist. Now let them join the police department and help stop other rapists. No, it's not the way it works. It's not the way it ever should work. It's horrendous. I mean, anybody would be shot for suggesting that with a physical crime, but with a computer crime, people have this wrong perception that being able to exploit something simple makes them a genius at it. It's kind of like, what's the analogy I sometimes use? It's sort of like, to a person, like to a caveman who barely got fire, a flashlight looks like magic. When you see like these corny things of like people going back in time with a flashlight, like bad comedy, the person doesn't know how to make the flashlight. They just know one more trick than the other person on the other side did. And that shouldn't be rewarded for knowing like a parlor trick, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. So we talk about, so we definitely have the issue that the things that people fall prey to are one subset of issues, and then how to keep them from falling prey is a different set of issues. So let's talk about what things people fall for, and then we can talk about what is entirely different about how we address those issues.
Well, we have a variety of different issues. So, for example, if we're talking about computer-based crimes, some of it, for example, is fairly simple, like phishing messages where people try to get people to download malware, or they get them to try to divulge credentials on fake websites that are then exploited. Like it's common, for example, to go ahead and send somebody a message saying your eBay account has issues. Here's your password reset to please confirm your identity. And then, people will log in on a malicious website. People will then steal the credentials and immediately go in and try to drain accounts if there's anything to be drained or so on. I once saw, for example, on eBay, accounts were compromised for nothing else than to run up auction prices on eBay. That's a rather benign case. It still could have been much worse, but that's one example. Now, so how do we get people not to fall prey? That takes a multi-layered effort, and this is just one type of example that I'm giving. But let's say, again, phishing messages. There's different things people should have, like vendors, people who provide email services such as Outlook, Gmail, or whatever, need to have filtering for malicious software and just delete these messages before they even get to the user. Or at least they should have some sort of verification. So, for example, if you go to click on a link, sometimes like within Gmail or Yahoo or whatever other services that are out there, if you try to click on a link, the link will warn you this message is not going to where it says it's going. So what we need cheap plug, talk about in my book, but is the concept of layering the defenses to first, like I use a counterterrorism analogy, and maybe this will help people understand this. So in the terrorism field, there's the concept of boom. Boom is where the bomb goes off. Then there is Left-a-boom, which is like what events lead to the bomb going off. And then there's Write-a-boom, how do you respond? Now, in terrorism, Left-a-boom involves trying to stop terrorists that exist, trying to harden the defenses. Boom involves trying to, like in an airplane, put containers around, like have bomb-resistant containers so if luggage blows up, it won't blow up the plane, as an example. And then Write-a-boom involves, okay, how do we know there are enough hospitals in place? How do we go ahead, for example, and make sure the first responders know how to respond appropriately in case there are secondary bombs and so forth. So there's training. There's also different disciplines along every step. Now, in, let's say, phishing, we have to first figure out how does a phishing message get to the user and where can we filter that out? Because there is a lot of harm, not just to the user, but to affected entities. So, for example, if a credit card's compromised, financial companies potentially lose money. If, like eBay, as the example I was given, if something happens with eBay, eBay loses money. The bidders lose money. So there's an infrastructure that really matters. So the infrastructure has to go ahead and say, let's try to filter out all the phishing messages first. Then let's try to build protections in. So that's Leftaboom. At Boom, we can help the user and say, okay, Mr. User, please respond and know that this message the link does not go to where it says it's going, and so forth. So that's one type of filtering. Then if a user clicks, yes, we should have better warnings. And I wish we would have public service messages for computer security the same way. Well, actually, I think we've got rid of a lot of public service messages, but I wish, people like Gmail and all these other vendors out there would send free security awareness tips and so on. I wish there was this, but, there's a little bit of it. But then we have the Writeaboom, where let's assume something goes wrong. The financial organizations need to start taking responses. So, for example, I was once contacted by American Express telling me or saying, did you make a charge from Greece buying a plane ticket from Belgium to Thailand? I go, no, I did not. Now, that was an easy one to flag since I would just use my credit card in San Diego at the time.
Yeah.
However, but these financial organizations likewise have this ability to try to track. The sites like eBay and everybody else are also trying to put in analytics to see what's unusual activity and stop unusual activity, limit transactions, and so on. A lot of people, however, get annoyed by security protection, and that's unfortunate. And there's no way that this happens. But for example, let's say I won't name the retailer, but there was a very, very large retailer that I was once visiting, and they were telling me how every time because another type of crime that occurs where people are impacted is where a website is hacked and somebody steals the user IDs and passwords, and then those user IDs and passwords end up on the dark web. And so what will happen is people reuse their user ID and password across multiple accounts. Let's, for example, talk about Ring. If you remember the recent incidents where Ring happened, what criminals were taking random user IDs and passwords that were logged or captured on the internet, on the dark web, and then trying to log on to Ring. So if somebody, for example, used the same email address that they would use at a retailer, I won't name a retailer, it would be wrong, but they take so somebody has an account at let's just say a CVS, a Walgreens, or whatever competitor it is, and that site gets hacked. Somebody takes the user IDs and passwords, puts it on the internet, and then a criminal goes ahead, grabs that, and reuses the same user ID and password that happened on one of the retailer sites for Ring.com. That's how the criminals were able to log on to Ring.com, look at children in their bedrooms, and interact with the children in their bedrooms. Yes, it wasn't necessarily a problem with Ring. It was a problem with people reusing their credentials and not enabling some extra security protocols, which again, when I speak at conferences, one of the stories I give is what the Wizard of Oz says about information security. And without going through the presentation with my puppets, the real story, the real moral of the Wizard of Oz is not there's no place like home. The real moral, if you actually think about it, is you have what you're looking for, you just don't know it or know how to use it. Much like Dorothy always had the slippers, which is what she needed to go home. Much like the Tin Man always, he wanted a heart, but he was the one crying the whole time, expressing emotion. The Scarecrow wanted a brain, but he was the smart one if you pay attention to the movies. He always had what they were looking for. The Lion, he wanted courage, and he really didn't get anything. He just went on a suicide mission with everybody else. So got to say he had courage. That was the moral. And likewise, with most tools out there where people get scammed, there is security in place. People are just not using it. Mm-hmm. So use it. Turn on multi-factor authentication on your Twitter accounts, on your eBay accounts, on whatever accounts you have, and that'll stop a lot of the online scamming.
I know you talked about, financial institutions needing to have better systems in place and processes in place. I ran across a situation where I was actually impressed with the financial institution in the way that they were handling what very likely could have been a fraud situation. I was sending money to a family member overseas legitimately. I know who they were. It wasn't a Nigerian scam. And it was the first time I had used this particular account for an international wire. And so I set it up and went on my merry way, and the following morning, I get a phone call from the bank saying, "Hey, we noticed that you set up an international wire to someone that you haven't sent money to in the past." And I got like the third degree from this person. How do you know this person? Where did you meet them? Are you sure that you're sending it to your relative and not somebody else? And how do you know that it's not somebody else? I was inside. I was again, like you're talking about, I was kind of annoyed with the security process, but on the inside, I was like, dude, this is awesome. The bank is watching out for my best interests, and they're like really doing their due diligence. And I told the woman, I'm like, "Hey, thank you for doing this. Like, I hear way too many times where this didn't happen and people lost money. But the fact that they did it was like, okay, so some institutions really are starting to take this sort of thing seriously."
Yeah, and it's sort of like when I went to Las Vegas, and this was the first time it really happened prominently. I went to use my credit card, and when I wanted to use my credit card, they said, "Could we see your ID?" I'm like, "Yes, you may." Because a lot of people are like, this is Las Vegas where people get drunk and leave their wallets around and somebody runs out. Now, I was just buying my $3.50 Diet Mountain Dew, which is a crime in and of itself that they were charging that much. But the reality, though, is there are people who try to charge much more. They run into Gucci and try to get something on a credit card.
Yeah.
And, people have to stop being offended when people put security mechanisms in place. And frankly, in many cases, I'm kind of like less wary or more wary to shop at stores that don't implement good security practices because, it's like, yes, I know I'm me, but at the same time, I really wish they would question other people because the reality is prices go up when other people are scammed.
Yep.
And so we need to do that.
I mean, I like with the credit card, I used to, for a long time, I would not sign the credit card and I would put CID on the back of the credit card. And I think I did that for years. And I think only like a half a dozen times did someone actually look at the back of the card and read that it said CID on it and actually ask me for my ID. The rest of the time it was they turn the card around, pretend that they're looking at it, and then go ahead and swipe it. I'm like, you didn't even the whole concept of having a signature on the card was pointless.
Right. And that's, it's a risk-based thing for you. I mean, you're not, again, for this time, it's like, what are you going to say? I'm not buying this thing now because you did not ask me for my ID. That's not going to happen. So some stores don't have this motivation. The thing, honestly, that bothers me most now that we start talking about it is when you have credit card companies calling people up and asking to speak with you and then want you to say, okay, what is your last 4 digits of your social security number? And I'm like, are you out of your mind? I mean, literally, I was 100% sure that really was the credit card company. But they are going ahead and asking me for a point of verification that I'm thinking if I was social engineering somebody, that's what I would do.
Yeah, I would do the same thing.
And they're actually training people to an insecure behavior. And that's horrendous on the part of credit card companies. They should say, hey, here's the thing. There's a problem with your credit card. Don't take my word for it. I need you to get out your credit card. Do you have that? Look at the number on the back of your card and call back that.
Yeah. And that's what I do. Anytime I've gotten a phone call from the credit card company, the person will say, hey, we think there's fraudulent activity on your card. I'm like, okay, thank you much. I'll call you back at the number on the card. And the real bank will say, that's a good idea. Anyone who answers will be able to help you. The scammer is going to say, oh, no, I can help you.
Well, there are some times there are some times where they're like, well, if you really want to, you can go ahead and call back. Because let me be honest with you. Again, as a social engineering trick, if somebody expresses hesitance, I would say, okay, look, here's the thing. There's a big problem with your credit card. I appreciate you want to do that. You can get out your credit card and go ahead and call up the number and then wait online to get it. And feel free to do that. But I'm here now if you want to go ahead and take care of that.
The convenience.
And then
wins.
I might have also done some pre-solicitation, or I might have done some research to find out a few more pieces of information that make it sound that much legitimate. But if I give people the option, I give them just enough information, I'm going to provide them. If I'm a criminal, I'll provide them with motivation. I'll provide them with an unattractive alternative, and 90% of the time, they'll give me the information I want. So anyway.
Yeah, scary. So I guess that it prompts the question, how do you stop stupid?
Well, again, there's a combination of stopping stupid from start to finish, because here's the thing. When a user taking the whole issue of counterterrorism, and frankly, a lot of it is safety science more than counterterrorism. But in the safety science field, if somebody is injured, it is a mistake. It is not the user's fault. It is the fault of the entire system where the user exists. In other words, somewhere they enable the user to put themselves in a position where they could be injured. They, for whatever reason, allowed the user to be injured. The user did something for whatever reason, and then the response did not lend itself to a satisfactory result. Now, when you look at the same thing, like I mentioned before, what we have to do is, if I'm a vendor, if I'm a credit card company, look, I would love to put myself in the position of each and every consumer out there. And I hate to say this, but most of the time, 90% of consumers are not going to fall for this scam, or any given scam. Most people, like you and I were talking about before we started recording to a little bit, when somebody gets a call from, hi, we're your credit card company and we have a new great offer for you. It's like, that doesn't sound right. They didn't mention which bank. They didn't mention MasterCard, Visa, American Express, Discover, whatever. They just had a vague description. 90% of people will automatically have that as a red flag and hang up. It automatically sounds like a recorded call. And frankly, most of the time when you look at the Nigerian scams, like the Nigerian prince scam, and somebody says, who would ever fall for this? And I once spoke to like an FBI agent, and they're like, in some cases, bad grammar is a feature because they want to weed out the intelligent people they don't want to interact with. And so anybody who is stupid enough to fall prey, even when they know they're going to get less than 1% of people, if they send out 100,000 messages, that is still like 0.1% is still 1,000 people.
Yeah.
That might respond. So they want to filter out. So anyway, coming back to this, it's great that people in the back of their mind, and we should promote this as much, there are scammers out there. And be aware, if something doesn't sound right, if something is out of the ordinary, stop, go back, hang up, and call the number in question directly. If it's a website, you get an email that could be critical. You don't click on the email message. You go ahead and you log directly onto the website in question, as an example. But at the same time, we do need a better infrastructure. We need an infrastructure that says, look, it is costly for organizations to allow their consumers to fall prey. So as an organization, we want to start filtering things out. We want to work with the ISPs, the email providers, and start filtering out attacks as best we can. And then we want to go ahead and put in a user experience. We want to put in warnings. For example, if you're a bank or a financial or a retailer, you want to put some verification on your website. You want to encourage people to implement multi-factor authentication. So even, for example, if somebody does give away their password. It's useless without the, two-factor authentication like a text message. And I know some people say, well, text messages are compromised sometimes. It doesn't matter. It's still exponentially stronger than not having it.
Yep.
Because, and here's the big thing. I need to step back. Anybody who ever tells you there can be perfect security is a fool or a liar. That is a given. There's always going to be elements of risk. There's not going to be perfect security. Even the smartest person in the world will make a mistake regarding what we're talking about at some point. Our goal is to try to make it as resilient as possible so that we put protections in place that if you're a consumer and you are offered the opportunity for multi-factor authentication, take it. Yes, it can be annoying, but the consequences of not doing it are infinitely more annoying.
Yeah, losing your life savings is a huge negative cost.
Exactly. And too many people are like, oh, this is it's like, well, it's death by 1,000 cuts. You think, oh, well, I don't want to do this. It's like, okay, you think it's a slight annoyance. That slight annoyance can save you a limb. So anyway, but then you do that, but then simultaneously we need the vendors and the infrastructure to put in place checks and verification, much like we were talking about, limitations on taking out money, a whole bunch of other stuff. Again, I must admit, I was once personally really, really annoyed because I was trying to take out cash because I needed $350 in cash for something, and I plugged in $350, and the bank refused my transaction. And then I went to a different bank and did it. And it turns out it refused it. Then I finally went to my personal bank and took it, and it allowed it. Why? Because the bank had limitations on other banks to what you could put out, but not on your I didn't know that. So banks have got to go ahead and let people know what their policies are. But I could be really, really upset. But there was one time, and you asked for a personal thing. And so one time I logged on to my bank account, and luckily I check it on a regular basis. And I saw that for the last 3 days in a row, there were withdrawals of $200 and $100 around the Los Angeles area, up around North Hollywood area. Not North Hollywood, but somewhere in that vicinity. Not one of the better areas, like somewhere of Sunset. And what happened was, I looked at that, and it was the same thing day after, for 3 days in a row, like a $200 transaction and a $100 transaction from 7-Eleven type places. And of course, I called up the bank, and I work with the bank. I go, okay, now here's the thing. This is clearly a scam. Those people are going to go back tomorrow. You should alert the police. They go there between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and odds are going to be really good that it's not just my one card, that there's a lot of other cards that they have that they've cloned, and so on, because I had the card in my wallet. So anyway, I went ahead, I was willing to work with them. I investigate this. I'm happy to help. They're like, okay, we'll make a note of it. I'm like, you're making a note of it? They're like, yeah, we're giving you your money back. I'm like, okay, but no, I want to stop these people. And they're like, okay, we'll make a note that you're willing to help. And then the guy goes, okay, here's the actual situation. In the first place, you go ahead, you get your money back. We then go to the people who own the cash machine, and we take our money back from them. And I'm like, okay, give me their contact information. And then I go, okay. And then they said, they have insurance that pays for this. Give me the insurance company. And they're like, we don't know who that is. And then I figured out, where was this? And the only place I figured out this could have come from was a month before that, because that was a card I rarely, R-A-R-E-L-Y, rarely, so I'm from New York, I have a problem with that. And what happened was, the last place I used that card was in Singapore on Universal Studio Walk on Sentosa Island. And I'm sitting there thinking, somebody had to have a camera and a skimmer at that system there, and then figured out it was a US-based card and gave it to people in Los Angeles to go ahead and skim out. It was that, so you asked when I was skimmed, it's like, and again, the only places I used that was at my bank, literally at the bank location, which I would like to assume wasn't compromised, or you can potentially assume that something on a very public walk in the middle of a public place in Singapore was the more likely place.
And those are the type of places that are targeted with skimmers, with lots of tourists coming by, people that are not paying attention to what's going on, not familiar with what the ATM machines in that country look like.
Yeah, and I thought, I'll tell you, it looked pretty good. I don't know if you ever saw the movie, I think it was Focus. But in the movie Focus, there was one scene where they were talking about different type of criminals around, I think it was the New Orleans area. And, because Focus was a movie about, ironically, scams and social engineering and con artists. And they showed somebody putting up a complete overlay of a cash machine, perfectly fit and perfectly sized. And it's the same thing where I've seen these type of things, like, for example, skimmers at Target. There's actual things where there's a perfectly sized skimmer that you put the card in, it swipes, it steals all the information as you put it in that you need. And even when you look at it, you really can't tell it's a fake. You have to look really, really carefully and try to remove the outside cover to know that's the scam.
And I've heard of situations where people put out entire fake ATM machines that distribute money in order to to basically skim the card. So you put your card in, you say, I want $200. It gives you the $200 and gives you your card back. Because you're no more the wiser. If you put your card in there, it said, oh, there's a problem, you're more inclined to be suspicious about, something's weird going on here. But they were actually putting ATM machines on corners that were spitting out cash just so it would become less there was less of a concern that there was something wrong.
Right. You had no idea. Look, it was a completely legitimate cash machine from all appearances, from every fake part you can. But really all it was a standalone computer that gave you the cash you asked for while capturing your information. Yeah. And you got to give these people credit. I shouldn't say give them credit. You have to admire the taking advantage of the system in a way that they were able to figure out how to compromise. I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's just a fact. And you have to, I'll use the thing, like one of my books I wrote was Through the Eyes of the Enemy, which was the autobiography of a colonel from Russia's GRU. He was like a spy master for them. And he was very distinct to use not enemy, but adversary. He's like, you must use the word adversary because when you use the word enemy, it leads to disdain, it leads to disrespect, and you must always respect your potential adversaries because you never know their capability, you never know when they'll get lucky, and it leads you to making mistakes. So you need to respect your potential adversaries in this case.
That's a very good distinction to make. So one more question before we close out. We were talking about systems that need to change. One of the things that has kind of, I like to travel internationally, and one of the things that's kind of perplexed me here in the States is that on credit cards, we don't use chip and PIN. And for those that don't know what that is, so in the U.S., most credit cards are chip and signature. There's a chip on the card, and then they just ask you to sign. In a lot of other countries, you actually have to enter a PIN code in addition to entering your credit card. Do you know, what is your thoughts on why that hasn't been adopted in the United States?
Well, here's the thing. In some cases, so with all authentication, there's the concept of multi-factor authentication, which always comes around to what you know, what you have, what you are. Those are the three types of authentication. Now, the thing is, people say, okay, let's look at the signature. Having the card itself with a PIN is what you have. Now, the PIN, having the card with the chip is what you have. Mm-hmm. The chip is frankly pretty strong. It's hard. It's not impossible, but it's not trivial to try to figure out how to get a fake credit card in. So that's one thing. So it's not likely. Now, the problem is in these type of cards where you have this, somebody could have theoretically cloned the chip these days, which is not as easy.
Let's go to the assumption of I just dropped my credit card on the ground.
Right, I'm getting to that.
Okay.
This is where we're on the same track. Now, the thing though is, okay, now we have a PIN. Now, the PIN accounts for a certain amount of risk that your credit card was just stolen. And now that your credit card was just stolen, how hard is it to compromise? That comes up to the fact of how much risk are we willing to assume as a culture. And so in Europe, it pretty much, there's very little risk people want to assume as a culture. In Europe, Europe and frankly, I don't think Asia, when I was there a few months ago, happened. But in Europe, they bring all the credit card machines directly over to you, where they bring it over, the card never leaves your hands, the transaction always happens in front of you, and they ask you to put the card in and enter the PIN. So that's the chip and PIN. Now, again, is that a perfect thing? Well, theoretically, you could put a camera over and still steal it. So it's not, like I said, there's nothing that's perfect. And so theoretically, it's a risk reduction tool. How important is it? Frankly, I don't think the risk reduction you get from it is overly important. It's overly critical. Is it nice to have? Sure, it's nice to have. Do I think it would prevent? I must admit, I did not look up the amount of fraud that would prevent, like how many chip cards are stolen and used before they could be canceled. It doesn't seem to be like it's that much of a threat in the U.S. that I'm going to say stop everything for.
Gotcha.
I would say, and then these days there's cameras, and it's like putting, like people hide cameras all over the place. So the pins are not as perfect as they ever should be. And frankly, how hard is it for like those, the waiters, for example, in Europe, to watch you push in your credit card number or your PIN number?
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's, chip and PIN is risk mitigation, but how much risk does it really mitigate?
Right, because you want to have, like, every time you put in a little bit of this, it's like, what is the convenience factor? It's not really that inconvenient to enter your PIN every time you put a chip in a machine. So it does require a different infrastructure. For example, like I mentioned, it requires like portable, like in restaurants, it requires portable terminals as an example. It might be realistic to say at gas pumps, for example, you use PIN and chip. When you're at a point of sale system, but again, it's a combination of risk and how much does it really mitigate, whether or not it's worth it.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So can you give us an overview of your book, You Can Stop Stupid? And then we'll make sure to put a link to it in the show notes.
Awesome. Well, anyway, my book, You Can Stop Stupid, is frankly based upon a lot of what we spoke about. Literally, it's about the fact that, I will phrase it this way, stupid is an effect. It's not a cause. When I refer to stupid, I'm not referring to the people, I'm not referring to the end user as an example. I'm referring specifically to the people who are stupid, as in the people who design the systems that allow people to be exploited. It talks about the science and the process behind how do you go ahead and put an infrastructure in, how do you protect yourself in advance before an attack reaches you? How do you react when the attack is in front of you? And then what can you do to potentially mitigate losses as quick as possible? Because I introduced the concept of user-initiated loss, where the issue is that a user doesn't create a loss, but a user is the pivotal point where a loss is initiated. Once a user initiates a loss, the reality is that you need to be able to mitigate it before the loss is realized. And that's probably as important as preventing the initiation as it is. That's as important as preventing the initiation, to mitigate the loss before it's realized. Because just because you make a mistake, it doesn't mean it should actually result in damage. And I'll leave it at that.
That's great. If people want to follow you on social media, how can they get a hold of you?
There's not that many Ira Winklers in the world, but literally not that many. But if you go to Twitter at Ira Winkler, just one word. LinkedIn is also Ira Winkler, and you'll find me, and Facebook, Ira Winkler, and then my website under construction at the moment, but irawinkler.com as well. It would be awesome.
Great. Ira, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Prey podcast. If you found this episode helpful, share it with someone you know and leave a review by visiting easyprey.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Ira Winkler can be found at easyprey.com/33.